Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. Find them at artistfirst.com. And now, your host, live from England, here she is. It's Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. This is Deborah Ruffini with another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today we are privileged to have Nancy Little with us on the show again, and we'll be exploring areas that people don't really like to cover when it comes to abuse. Nancy, thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. It's great to be back.
Oh, it's been a while, isn't it? I'm trying to think when we last spoke. Last year?
It's been last year, I think.
Oh, yeah. And you're always very informative and give us something to think about. And also covering those sort of issues that lots of people don't really want to. We want to brush it under the carpet. We want to put our heads in the sand. We don't really want to think about it because it's out there. And so it's good that we bring it back here. We need to bring things back here. So we're sort of going down different routes with things today, aren't we? And one of the big issues which survivors struggle with is self-harming, and therapists sometimes, you mentioned briefly before, that they don't really want to touch on the subject. Is that right?
Yes. As most of your viewers know who followed my story, they know that I was sexually abused by my mother. There was a lot of emotional, a lot of physical, a lot of verbal abuse. There was some physical abuse by my dad on occasions. There was a lot of domestic violence in our home. And children, especially teenagers, as they grow up, they have to find a way of coping with what they're going through and still live in the real world. They still have to go to school, they still have to do the homework, they still have to go to church or whatever other activities their families may be involved in. And so they have to find ways to cope.
Yeah.
And the older a child gets who's still stuck in an abusive situation, they still have very little choices on how they cope.
Yeah.
I coped when I was very young by reading. I've always loved to read. I learned to read very early. But as I grew into a teenager, there was a lot of chaos in our house. We moved 3 times when I was a sophomore in high school. All of that is traumatic when things are constantly just changing.
Yeah.
You know, we moved one place. I was there 30 days, and we had to move again. And so when you have that much dishevelness in a family, and in the meantime, all the abuse is still going on, you look for other ways of coping. And for me, it started with self-harm. And it's important to know that one can engage in an action and have no name for it.
Yeah.
I was in my early 30s and the early 90s before I ever knew this had a name.
Okay.
And I happened to be watching the Oprah Winfrey Show, which is was a big show here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And she had someone, a guest star on her show, and that was the subject, was self-harm. And for the first time, that light bulb went off in my head. And for me, it started with, I needed a way to let out the anger. And that's often how it starts. And so I started I couldn't yell at my parents, because if I yelled at my parents, then, I was as good as dead. And so that wasn't an option. I couldn't talk to my teachers. We had been taught from a very young age what happened at home stayed at home. You don't tell anybody what goes on at home. So I knew I couldn't tell what was going on to anybody else. Sexual abuse by mothers is still misunderstood in 2024, and 1974, 75, when I was a young teenager, no one would have known what to do, even if I had told.
Yeah.
And so I just felt like I had no way out. And feeling trapped is just an overwhelming, just horrible feeling. And so I started, when no one was around, I started with kicking trees, bruising my knees, hitting my knees, just anything that I could get the anger out.
Yeah.
And so it started with simple things like that, because given that I had JRA, which is juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, I bruised anyway, so I could, if anybody asked questions, I was able to pass it off on my disease.
Yes.
And so the one thing you learn very quickly is how to cover it up.
Okay.
And it wasn't something that I did every day, but when it just got too much and I couldn't handle all the violence at home and I couldn't handle the abuse, then it was an outlet. And studies showed that self-injury begins usually somewhere between 12 and 14.
Okay.
Somewhere in those early teen years. And they also showed that between 13 and 23% of all teenagers have either cut, burned, or somehow otherwise injured themselves. And so it's something that we really need to talk about. Some therapists call it non-suicidal self-injury.
Right.
Which is a way of just distinguishing it from those who are actively trying to kill themselves. Because we're not trying to kill ourselves, we're just trying to find a way to stay alive and make it through those tough years until we can either get out, find another way to deal with it. But often, because you learn this behavior in a way to deal with your frustration, your anger, then even when you're out of that situation, it has become a learned response.
Yes.
That when you're dealing with, as you grow up, you get out of the house, you go to college, you get married, you get a job, whatever situation that you find yourself in, there are triggers that will remind you of the abuse, whether it is coming directly from your family and you have family involvement, whether it's just your everyday life and somebody could say a phrase that one of your abusive parents used to say to you, and that triggers.
Yes.
That triggers the memory. It triggers those feelings, and those intense feelings that you felt as a teenager come rushing back. And so you end up self-injuring again because that's the way that you dealt with it as a teenager.
That all makes sense.
And so, as a young adult, when my daughter was very young, 2, 3, 4, she was very young, that was when I had finally found an excellent therapist in my city that could help me deal with the sexual abuse by my mother and all the other family trauma that went along with it.
Yeah.
But when you do that kind of intense therapy, all those feelings, the thoughts, the memories, the emotions all come just rushing back and can be overwhelmingly painful.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I had started cutting and at times burning myself.
Ooh.
And it was a way to kind of, one, deal with the pain, the memories, everything that came back. But it was also a way to stay alive.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to kill myself, but I was trying to cope with all these memories and the thoughts and the feelings that were coming back, and not just in one memory, but thousands of memories. And it just felt like, kind of like if you've ever been out in the ocean and a wave takes hold of you and you get swept out into the ocean so quickly and you have that feeling of, I'm going to drown out here. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
At least what it felt like to me was that I was going under and I didn't have a lifeboat or anybody to save me. And so the cutting in a very odd type of way is what saved me at the time. It kind of woke me up out of that panic.
Yeah.
And so when you cut or when you self-injure yourself, it kind of brings you back to the present. It kind of wakes you up with that feeling of the pain. It kind of snaps you back to reality. And it will bring a sense of calmness.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds very strange to the people who have never had to self-injure, but it kind of brings you back to that calm, relaxing state. And as, it took me quite a while before I was able to even talk to my therapist about it, and she was the one who actually had figured it out. Had seen some marks on my arms, even though I tried to keep them covered. And so a lot of therapists today still will not see anybody who self-injures, and that's a shame.
Why is that?
Because how are people supposed to heal from their abuse if they can't be totally honest about how they're coping with that abuse?
Why do you think that is? Sorry.
Because it scares therapists.
Oh. Because
a lot of therapists still think that if you're self-injuring, you're trying to kill yourself. And so my therapist talked to me, and we came up with a list. Here are some things I want you to try to do, Nancy, before you self-injure. And we made a list, a handwritten list of I can journal, I can take a brisk walk, I can take my daughter to the park, I can, it was just practical things that I could do to help calm me down. She worked with me with grounding techniques, and that was finding something in my house that I didn't have as a child so that I could look at that, and when I had those overwhelming feelings of the memories that were coming rushing back in flashbacks, where it feels like it's happening again, that the abuse that you suffered as a child was happening at that moment, I could look at that item, hold it, touch it, and start to think I did not have this blanket, or I did not have this stuffed animal, or I did not have this pet when I was a child. I am in present year. I am safe, I am okay, and it is not happening to me again. And all these practical things are things that people can do first before you result into cutting. And she told me, my biggest fear was somebody hauling me off to a psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
And that is a fear that most every survivor that I've ever talked to has, because a lot of people have misunderstood people who are dealing with trauma and think the way to cure them is just to send them to a psychiatric hospital. And that, for the most part, is not really helpful. There are some people who have certain mental disorders that might be appropriate, but for the majority of us, we can live in the real world. We just need someone to help guide us and to help us through working through that trauma that we experienced. And it took me a while before I could feel comfortable in talking to my therapist about it. But once she brought it up to me and we made a list of things we could do, she said, Nancy, I won't ever try to put you inpatient anywhere as long as you promise. And I had to sign a contract that I would do these items first before I self-injured. And slowly, as I started learning different techniques of handling the pain, handling the flashbacks, handling the memories, what happened was less and less I needed to self-injure.
Okay, all right. That's interesting.
And so it became in the beginning, a lot of survivors think that, okay, I've got to make it 2 weeks without harming myself. I've got to make it a month. I got to make it 2 months. And they put this pressure on themselves, and I did it too. And then if I self-injured, then I just felt like, God, I was the worst, horrible person there is alive. That's the kind of self-taught that you start putting on yourself. And I realized one day that was making it worse for me.
Yeah.
And so instead of looking at it as I've got to go a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months without self-harming myself, I changed my thinking to, I'm going to do these things that I'm learning to cope with the memories and the flashbacks first, and just keep at that and not put a pressure that I have to go so long without self-harming, because if I did self-harm, what that did was just made me feel even worse about myself, and I just sabotaged myself.
Yeah.
So I took that pressure off, and slowly it just happened naturally. It just became less and less and less of me needing to. And my therapist would always tell me, she said, Nancy, when you climb the stairs up to a stairwell, for the most part, you're not taking 5 steps at a time. And so doing therapy and learning how to cope with my memories and flashbacks, you're going to take 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. Yeah. 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. And it's going to be that. It's a process. It's learning how to live in the real world with the memories and the feelings and the flashbacks, learning to cope with them in a healthy, better, more appropriate sort of way, but be gentle with yourself if you do screw up. It's not the end of the world.
No, that's right.
Tomorrow is another day, and there were days for a long time, for a good probably 2 years, where I didn't just look at it, there's going to be better days. I had to look at it, there'll be a better hour coming ahead.
Yeah, that's
because
good.
I felt like I was so fragile for a long time. I would tell my therapist, her name was Nancy too, which could be a little bit confusing, but I would tell her, what if I'm just too damaged to ever heal?
Okay.
What if there's just too much, for me to heal? And she would tell me that, and I would tell her, I don't see any hope. And she would say, Nancy, I'm going to hold the hope for you.
Oh, yeah.
Until you can feel the hope. And that's what I tell people now that I'm working with.
Yeah.
Is that I know right now that you don't see an out and you don't feel that hope, but I'm going to hold your hope for you, because there is hope.
Oh, that's
and she
beautiful.
was right.
Yeah.
I have worked through all of this, and now I spend my life trying to help other people. But I've recognized over the last couple of months when, you and I hadn't talked, I thought, this comes up with other people I work with. It's still a problem even in the therapy world.
Yes.
Because I've heard from people who will say, as soon as I told my therapist I self-harm, they said goodbye.
That's awful.
And stop working with me. And how does that help a survivor deal with abuse and learn to deal with the flashbacks and learn to deal with the trauma if the one person they're going to for help tells them they're not going to see you anymore?
Yeah, that requires even deeper help, doesn't it? It's not just like a dismissive, okay then, see ya. And
it makes them feel like again, it makes them feel like, well, I'm just too damaged I'm just too damaged that I can't heal. And that can send somebody into a suicidal problem.
Right.
When the one person they're going to for the help is telling them that, basically you're just too screwed up for me to work with you. And so people do one of two things, and usually it's one thing, and that is they just, again, keep hiding it.
Yeah.
And they won't tell the therapist because they live in that fear if the therapist finds out that the therapist will end working with them. And so it just keeps that secret buried even more. And how is a person supposed to heal if they can't be honest? And, I'm blessed that I had a therapist who addressed it. It didn't seem to, what I would say, scare her off. I'm sure that it scared her from time to time because in the beginning I was self-harming a lot. But as I began to heal, that got less and less. And I'll be honest, it took years.
Yeah, I bet.
For me to completely stop self-harming. And for a long time, and I know this is going to sound really screwed up, but people who self-harm will understand it. For the longest time, I kept the glass that I used to cut myself hidden.
Oh, right, yeah.
I didn't use it. But it was a comfort knowing it was there if I needed it.
Oh, yeah.
And then over time, I started throwing it out. And now it's been, 15, 17 years since I've self-harmed and haven't needed it and don't keep anything in the house anymore.
That's great.
And now I work with other people who do it. But I just feel like this is such a big issue.
Yeah. Isn't it? You've come so far.
And it's something that needs to be talked about because if you talk to a half a dozen women, probably 2 out of 5 either have self-harm or know somebody who has self-harm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
But we've got to change the idea of when you talk to someone who does this, of having that shock reaction or telling them, I don't want to talk about it, that's too scary, or even if you're not comfortable with it, at least just hear them out.
Yes.
You can say, I don't really know anything, I don't know how to help you, but I can help you find some help.
Yeah.
And there's so much now that is written on it online, and people are engaging and they don't know where to reach out. Go online and Google it.
Yes, that's true. It's not hard, is it? Yeah.
Like my therapist did with me. Sit down when you're not in a panic and you're not upset and write out things I can do before I need to self-harm. And it can be very simple things from taking a walk to going to the park. I used to go to the baseball batting cages. I don't know if y'all have them where you're at, but here we have batting cages where you can hit baseballs that come out of an automatic
okay, that sounds
thing,
fun.
and you can hit baseball. And this was before my arms and fingers and elbows got so bad, and I would go over there, and for an hour, I would just hit the baseballs one after another, just as hard as I could. And that is a healthier way of self-harming because you're doing something active.
Yeah.
And you can put all that anger in hitting the baseball. And when I didn't have money to do that, I would go throw the baseball up against the side of the house.
Yeah.
Or go out with my daughter because she played baseball, and we would throw baseballs to each other. But find something physical. I threw darts at a dartboard for the longest time. Find something to do before you go to the self-harm.
Yeah.
And slowly you'll start learning that there's other things that can help those feelings when they come up, besides cutting or bruising or burning or some other way of harming your body.
Yeah. So the sort of principle of self-harm is it's almost like, is it kind of diverting the emotional pain into the physical? Because anything but the emotional pain is, got to be more bearable.
Exactly.
Yeah. That makes sense, doesn't it?
And, a lot of people have, when they become adults, have realized that I've almost become numb.
Yeah.
And so when they are thinking about the abuse, cutting themselves or harming themselves is a way to kind of snap them back to reality.
Yeah.
It makes them feel again in a weird sort of way. And we've got to find a way to build in our life for us to be able to feel without having to hurt our bodies.
Yeah, yeah.
And see, like for me, I grew up in a household that taught there were two feelings, happy or sad. And because we were a very religious household, happy was the only feeling that was quote unquote acceptable.
Yeah, yeah.
So all those feelings of shame and anger and frustration and disappointment that I was feeling as a child when I was being abused, I couldn't express that. That had to go deep, deep inside. Because we were never allowed to, you watch sitcoms and dramas where kids get upset and go to the room or slam the door. I was never allowed to do that. You were never allowed to show you were upset, other than my parents did. Obviously, they fought like cats and dogs, and my dad beat my mother, but they were allowed to do it. They were adults.
Yeah.
But my sister and I were not allowed to do that. And so all those feelings you have to bury. And so they can be very frightening as an adult. When you grow up, you move out, you get married, and you start living your own life. All of a sudden, you've got all these emotions you don't know what to do with.
No, of course.
And so you either numb them out or you become addicted to drugs or alcohol. But for many of the people that self-harm, we just stuck everything so deep inside. The self-harm is a way to kind of wake you up to reality of start feeling again. And so to heal, we have to replace that with something. We have to find healthy ways of letting out our emotions in a healthy way that doesn't involve hurting our bodies.
Yeah.
Because the ultimate goal is to learn to cope not only with the abuse and work through that, but just in everyday life, because it can become a substitute for expressing emotions. And that's where it kind of can become an addictive behavior.
Yes.
And that's what happened with me, because the more you do it, it becomes a little bit easier each time. And so you have to break that with something. It's kind of like throwing a stick in the middle of a bike wheel. You have to stop it somehow. And so that's why my therapist sat down with me and we figured out a list, and we added to the list as, I learned other things that helped. And also learning how to self-talk to yourself and say things like, this memory is going to pass.
Yes, yeah.
I am okay. And that sounds like a simple thing, but when in the middle of a flashback and all the memories and feelings and the words your parents said, and it feels like it's happening again, it's not a simple thing.
No.
And so my therapist also sat down with me, and we wrote out a list of these things to say to myself.
Okay.
I am okay. This is just a memory. This will pass. I'm in a safe place. My parents are not here. I'm not really being hurt by them right now.
Yeah.
And whatever year it is right now, because when you're in the middle of a flashback, it makes you feel like you're 6 or 8 or 9 years old again.
Yes,
and
that's
you
true.
can forget that it's present day and that you're not actually back there again.
Yeah. Yeah, my goodness, that does actually make sense, doesn't it? And also, it's what a contributing factor is that your parents were very almost like calculated it in knowing that they could do what they did to you and then say, hang on a minute, you've got to now put gaffer tape over your emotions because you can only be happy.
Right. Right.
It's just that's like a double whammy, isn't it?
And see, because that was for me, for my sister and I, that was not just that, but it was also tied up into what we were taught at church. And we were taught that God only likes happy people. God doesn't want you to be angry. All the things that you read in the Bible about Jesus. He got angry. He turned the tables in the temple. But somehow all of that was completely overlooked at our house. And you weren't supposed to talk about that.
Yeah.
God only loves you if you're happy. But that never made sense to me, considering my parents were always screaming at each other. And my dad often hit my mother, and there were times my mother would hit my dad. And so when you're a child, you're trying to not just work through your trauma and survive, but you're also watching all this chaos going on around you. And it's hard to figure out if you're coming and going some days.
Yeah.
And so what you do is it's almost like you put blinders on your eyes and, like a racehorse. And you just focus on going to school, eat your dinner, do your homework, go to sleep. Go to school, do your homework, eat your dinner, go to sleep. And so you put a blinder on all your feelings and everything else that's going around. And you just try to do those 4 or 5 things.
Yeah.
But when you grow up and you move out and you're an adult, then you have real life. You've got a job, you've got a spouse or a partner, you've got all these things coming to you, and you're living in the real world, but yet in your head you're still this kid that's going, wake up, eat breakfast, go to school, do your homework, go to sleep. You're still in that mindset of how you coped as a small child.
Yes, yeah.
And so when you realize that's not working anymore.
Yeah.
And you have to deal with bosses, and you have to deal with spouse, and you have to deal with real life in your marriage, and you have all these things that are going on around you. The way you coped as a child doesn't work anymore.
No, that makes sense, yeah. Oh my goodness, yeah, it's a horrific thing, isn't it? And going back to, conflicting messages where you're taught one thing, but the behaviour around you is totally contradicting that. And I once heard a sermon, which really, stayed with me for many years about the whole thing about Jesus, going nuts in the temple and flipping over tables, and then it goes on to say he went outside and made a whip. And you think, my goodness, the anger righteous anger, like with what we're dealing with, righteous anger, Christ must have been in quite a state to actually go outside and make a whip.
Absolutely.
And again with this whole thing, oh yeah, Jesus wants a gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and think, no, yeah, and they don't seem to think that sort of behaviour is something Christ would have been absolutely against. And we can form scripture to what we want it to be in accordance to how we want to treat people, can't we?
They do, and we touched on this a little bit before, but it bears repeating. our pastors, our ministers at our churches, they need to do more to learn about abuse and how it affects adult survivors.
Yeah.
Because pastors have a big responsibility, not just to preach God's word, but also to minister to their flock, their people that come to church. And I've noticed over the years, we have in the U.S., and I'm not sure where you live, but here we have some 12-step groups that meet in churches. You have AA groups that will meet at not a church time. You'll have Celebrate Recovery, which is an organization to help people, who struggle with some of these issues, eating disorders and post-traumatic stress and anxiety. But you know what we don't have anymore?
What's that?
We don't have any groups for women who were sexually abused, or even for men for that matter.
Actually, that's true. Yeah, same here. Same over here, yeah. Yeah, I don't think so.
And
I can't think of any.
There used to be, I went to one in the 90s for probably 3 years, give or take, maybe a little bit longer. I've lost track. But now you can't find a group for men or women who were sexually abused. And I find that tragic.
Yeah.
Because especially in the church, that's supposed to be the one place you can go and bare your soul and be honest and not feel like you've got to hide. But when your pastors don't even understand it, and I'm not saying the pastors have to run the group, but there ought to be groups for survivors of abuse in our churches, just like their AA groups.
Yes.
And like their Celebrate Recovery groups. And we seem to have dropped the ball on that. And I know that really wasn't, the sole purpose of our discussion today. But it bears repeating, I think, because it's all connected.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things of finding help. And there are people, that's one reason I volunteer with people and talk with them even now, because there's people that can't afford to go to a licensed therapist. And, I still run my group 3 nights a week for survivors of sexual abuse.
That's great.
During the week, I've been doing that for 26, 27 years now, a long time.
Wow.
But if you go to just about any church off the street, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a pastor who is well-versed in abuse, how it affects survivors as an adult, and what they can do to help them. And we really need to start talking to pastors and people who are in pastor roles of, why aren't you seeking out people in your church who can run a group like that? Because there's actually programs that have workbooks and a study guide. And that's what I did for 3 or 4 years in the 90s, and they still make them, but we've just kind of forgotten about it somehow, and I don't really understand why.
I wonder if part of it is to do with, it's very straight. The church seems to be petrified of sex. Yeah, it seems to be obsessed with it, especially when it comes to things like homosexuality. And I wonder if part of it is to do, and I'm not making excuses, but the whole area of sex. Let's leave it out there. But anything else, like Gamblers Anonymous or any other sort of struggle, is kind of like anything that's non-sexual is all right to deal with. I don't know. Do you think that's part of it?
I think the biggest thing that I've seen over working with pastors is embarrassment. They do not want to believe that, number one, they don't want to believe that any of their flock deals with pornography, for number one.
Yeah.
You could add gambling in there, too. Any kind of addiction or drugs. they still believe that everybody who comes to church is free of all that. And we're just, I mean, we're all flawed individuals. And pastors need to come to terms with the fact that people in their church are going to struggle with these types of things. The one thing I've noticed is that, and I've been to several churches over the last 10 years, have no trouble speaking against the gays and homosexuality from the pulpit. But you know what they don't talk about?
What's that?
They will not talk about the man who goes home after church and beats his wife or molests his daughters. That's not ever talked about from the church.
No. And again, I think it's...
We don't have a problem bashing the gays, but we certainly have a problem dealing with men who rape their daughters and mothers who rape their daughters. And we certainly don't talk about the man, you know, who's a Sunday school teacher and goes home and beats on his wife. We don't talk about that.
No.
And so pastors pick, a lot of them, not saying all of them, but some of them, pick and choose what they find is important because it's in the society and they deem it's acceptable to talk about. You know, like, okay, you know, the gays, that's something that, you know, is more on the forefront, so we'll talk about that. Yeah. But, you know, we're not going to talk about the other things. And that's the part that really upsets me, is that we can't be honest about the guy who is abusing his wife and his daughters. Yeah. But we'll pick on one group of people because that is somehow more acceptable. Yeah. Yes. From the pulpit. And we've got, as people, we have got to be talking to our pastors and ministers and talk to them and say, you know, why is this not discussed from the pulpit? And I know that confronting pastors or even trying to just sit down and talk to them can be a scary thing, but if it doesn't start by the people who go to church, you know, who's going to start that conversation? Because if we wait for them to do it, I don't think it's going to happen. No. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, as you know, I'm gay myself, and a part of the reason I don't go to, even if it's a gay-friendly church, I still wouldn't go because there's always going to be a few people that are going to highlight this thing. And I think there's a lot of truth in, a bit like atheists who, where Christianity is easy target. It's easy to target a faith where a man, you know, died a torturous death on a cross some 2,000 years ago, but Buddhism would be sort of like cool. And I think the same sort of thing, Nancy, is that it's easy to pick on, if you're not homosexual yourself, if you're not a same-sex attraction yourself, it's easier to pick on those who are, even if it's something that doesn't actually harm other people. It's not involving, you know, physically beating or rape or infidelity. Two people just loving each other. It's easier to pick on that because, it's two people of the same. Absolutely. You just hit the nail on the head, and my husband had brought that up last week because one of the churches we had gone to recently was picking on the gays. And it seemed like every other service he'd throw in some comment somehow about either gays or trans or both. Yeah. And it's infuriating because we would leave and my husband would go, okay, so, you know, the gays who aren't harming anyone, they're not going home and beating on their spouse, they're not molesting children, and all these people who think that gays are sexual predators need to look at statistics. Yes. 97% of all children who are molested by straight people. Yeah. So this idea that your children are going to get molested by some gay person is not fact-based. That's just fear coming out. But we've got to get our pastors to start looking at, you've got a lot of hurting people in your congregation. Give them a way to deal with it. Allow somebody who, is well versed in abuse, let them run a group during the week.
Yeah.
Let them, we've got Celebrate Recovery that meets, we've got AA that meets. We don't have a problem with that.
Yes, yeah.
So why not allow somebody who wants to do a group for those sexual abuse survivors, let them have a group. But until we can start being honest with our pastors, until the pastors can start being honest with themselves, there should be no shame in sexual abuse survivors getting help at church.
Absolutely.
That should be the one place it should be okay to go, but yet it's the last place that most survivors will go because they fear being told that it was their fault.
Yes.
And I'm afraid that a lot of pastors, even though they would never admit it, they still blame the kids for it.
Oh.
Well, if they had, done this, right, or not worn this piece of clothing at home, then this wouldn't have happened. And we all know that isn't true.
Yep.
But we've got to get rid of those stigmatized ideas behind it.
Yeah.
And start looking at the truth, because for survivors, in order for them to heal, we need a safe place to go to.
Absolutely.
And for those who can't afford a licensed therapist or live out in the middle of nowhere, I've talked with the lady who had answered me on one of the previous recordings that you and I did, and she lived like 3 hours from the nearest therapist's office. So she doesn't have an alternative to go see someone.
Yeah.
But if there was a group at her church, then at least she would have a safe outlet where she could talk with other survivors and stop feeling so daggone alone all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so,
too right.
Even if a pastor doesn't understand self-harm per se, he could do so much good by just having someone in his church run a group for survivors of sexual abuse, because at least that would be an outlet for other survivors to meet with other survivors. Because one of the things that keeps survivors into that cycle of self-harm is feeling so alone.
Yeah.
That they have no one they can talk to, no one they can reach out to. They think no one will understand. But if you bring together people who do understand, then all of a sudden they're not feeling so alone. And because when you feel alone, you feel that pressure, like you're going to burst because you have like no support system at all.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to even be able to share with my my husband.
Yes,
about
I bet.
self-harm. And I actually had him come to therapy with me and had my therapist walk him through it, because I was hiding it from him too.
Yeah.
And you become, when you start doing this as a teenager, by the time you grow up and you do get in a relationship, and if you do marry or you do get with a partner, you have become well-versed on what to say to people to make it seem like it's not what is really going on. And so, I had a handful of excuses of why I had marks. And so for me to be able to be honest with him and share with him what was happening, again, that took some of that pressure off of me.
Yes, of course, yeah.
It was like I was finally being able to just let out that big sigh that you've got pent up inside of you for so long.
Yeah.
And the more that I can be honest with him about, hey, I'm feeling like I need to cut or self-harm, right now because this is what's happening, the more I was able to share that with him, then it took the pressure off of really needing to follow through on that.
Yeah.
Because you self-harm when you feel like you absolutely cannot take it one more second.
Yeah.
And so when I had a outlet to be able to be honest with my husband, to be able to be honest with my therapist, then that took some of that pressure off of feeling like I need to do that at that particular moment. And so, again, that, building that support system, whether it's a church or whether it's another group somewhere else that meets, they used to do groups for survivors at a rape and sexual abuse center. That's where I got my counseling many, many years ago.
Right.
And now it's even hard to find groups there. And that's what I don't understand. It's almost like we've gone backwards and people are ashamed of it again.
Yeah.
And the more that we do that, it just perpetrates that idea that this is something to be ashamed about.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
We have to get past that for people to be able to heal.
Yes.
It's not a topic that people like to talk about. It makes you feel uncomfortable and queasy, and most people just don't like to talk about that. But we've already lived through the worst.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And I tell the people I work with now, you've already lived through it.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen again. You're out of that situation. So now it's just working through and changing what you told yourself it meant.
Yeah.
Because as adults, when we first start our therapy, we're not looking at it in an adult mind right now, currently. We're looking at it from the child's point of view of what we told ourselves back then. If I had just done this, or this, Mom or Dad wouldn't have had to hurt me.
Yeah.
And so we take those thoughts and those feelings into adulthood. And that's what we have to challenge now. That's what we have to work on, changing those beliefs so that we don't continue to blame ourselves.
Yeah.
But if we can't be honest with other people and they don't allow us to be honest, how does that get changed?
Absolutely. Oh, Nancy, you speak so much truth, and we just need everyone to hear this. And it's sorry, I could listen to you all day. Our time is unfortunately gone, but it's so right, and I think we need this message out there. And it also, you have a very compassionate way of coming across, and that it's okay and there's nothing wrong. It's because, and I think because all you've been through has kind of equipped you, hasn't it, to tell others that it's not their fault. It is okay. And it's
if nothing else comes out of what I went through, I'm just hoping that my experience can help someone else.
And that's brilliant.
And to me, that's the biggest goal for me, is that I can't change what happened to me, but if I can use what happened to me, help somebody else, then at least it wasn't totally for nothing.
That's beautiful. And do you know what? I think your riches are in heaven. I honestly think, I honestly think your riches are in heaven, because, it's an awful thing. It's almost like an offensive thing to say, okay, God, the Lord allowed this to happen to you so that you can, but I don't know where sort of like, why bad things happen to good people, but I think God is definitely working through you to save others and help others. And I think your riches are, and it's concentrating on that, that, you're in for a mansion in the afterlife. I really do think. Oh, Nancy, God bless you. And is it all right if we have the link on the homepage to your now website, Is it a website?
Yes, absolutely.
And
you want me to say it now, or just put it on your site?
I'll put it on the homepage once for the people to see and make contact with you as always. And thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing with us, and just being a light in the darkness. A light in the darkness. There is hope.
Well, thank you for allowing me once again to share a little bit more of my story, and hopefully in sharing that we'll be able to reach other people and help them as well. Absolutely,
and we'll speak further in a short while, because it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and you're one of the that's what it's all about, isn't it? With the main thread of the broadcast is sort of like dealing with abuse and spiritual things and abuse and connected. So thanks again, Nancy. And to the audience at home, take on board what wonderful Nancy has shared, and you're not alone, and there is help, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Nothing was your fault as well, so it's taking that on board. And until next time, lots of love and God bless.